Our speaker today is one of the more respected venture lawyers here in New York City, Charles Torres. His Twitter handle is at Charles Torres, and he works at Lowenstein Sandler, where he's a partner, and he's going to take us through a big picture curriculum today on 5 different subjects. So let's give Charles a warm Columbia welcome.
Thank you. I'll take the clicker. Thanks, Dave, for the introduction. It's a perfect segue from the idea that Columbia is trying to tie a bunch of its different schools together to come together for an entrepreneurship program. That is what entrepreneurship is about. It's a collaboration of different skill sets to come together forward a project, for a singular project, and to take an idea from its very inception to become a company to hopefully exit, whether it be IPO or a sale. And the creation of this company, I've been doing this for 18 years. I love the creative part of the process as well as the legal part of the process, and guiding entrepreneurs from that idea stage all the way to fruition. And hopefully it's a sale or an IPO. When we think about formation, from a linear perspective, we'll start with where to form, right? And I suspect all of you have heard that Delaware is a popular place to form, right? And maybe you know why, or maybe you don't. So let's talk about the reasons why it is so popular, because indeed it is, and at about 98% of our startups will all form Delaware C Corps. I'll get to C Corp later, but Delaware. Why Delaware? Terrific Chancery Court. Chancery Court deals with governance issues for corporations and LLCs and business disputes, right? It's a great court because it does this a lot. So it's one of those self-actuating realities, right? Because so many companies form in Delaware, Delaware courts get a lot of opportunity to keep resolving these issues and changing their law, and it just continues to grow. So it's a very great court system, and what it promotes is reliability. It's a fully vetted body of case law. Because it's fully vetted and it's reliable, lawyers can give opinions, right, on what might or might not happen, or what should happen, or the results of things. And we can give likelihoods, and we can talk about what the law says, and then when we can do that, then business persons can make their decisions accordingly, right? Without a fully vetted body of law, you don't know what's going to happen, right? Part of a reticence that some investors might have in China is, well, I don't know what's going to happen with my investment, right? Like, if you're thinking about that. It doesn't happen with Delaware. Delaware is a great place to go for that reason. There's also favorable statutory protections for officers and directors, right? It offers a high level of indemnification and protection on a statutory basis. And also, it offers a facility and ease of administration for your C Corp by allowing the company to function with things called written consents instead of always holding a meeting, right? And doing other things and notices that allow you to, a little bit more easily contact your shareholders. Those are important parts of the law. So for example, I've heard people come to me and say, well, I've heard Texas is great. It is. It could be, but if you look at the law, there might be some supermajority voting requirements, and indeed there are, for actions that you might want to take. So all of a sudden, where Delaware is majority, which makes sense, right? It's simple majority. If you go to another state, it might not be. And you may have to find out whether it is or it's not. So then you got to find an attorney that's vetted in that other state. And what I've found is that most attorneys know 2 states really well. They know their state in which they practice, and they know Delaware. So that's why I think what's happened. So Delaware becomes this second default for everyone other than in Delaware, in which case it's the primary and secondary. All the cool kids are there. I mentioned before about 98% of the startups that we work with are all incorporated in Delaware. So that's kind of a. What about taxes? There are franchise taxes, and people ask that question as well. But every state will have a franchise tax that you have to pay. Hopefully you can manage it so that it's a minimal tax. And we certainly try to do that. Anywhere else, the other 2 states that people often mention are Nevada and Texas. From our perspective, Nevada opens up a question of why Nevada, and people get very curious as to why it's there. There are these shareholder secrecy laws in Nevada which help a company, but But I always tell founders, go with Delaware. Investors know that. There's no reason for you to distinguish yourself based on state of incorporation, right? You distinguish yourself based on product, not the state of incorporation. What to form comes the next question. We got Delaware down. All right, we're set. So what do we form? A corporation, an LLC, or an S corp? This is probably the question I get the most, right? Even irrespective of Delaware or the state to incorporate, is what should we form? And the reason why I get that is because I think there's a perception that an LLC is easier, cheaper, and quicker to form than a C corp. I used to agree with that perception. I'll be quite frank. There was a period of time in the mid-2000s when I was thinking, C corps, LLCs are great. It allows a founder to take losses from the development of the assets of the company and the disposition. You're putting in money into the company, and maybe I could take the losses on my personal taxes. Because here's how an LLC works. An LLC says, well, let me take a step back. Sorry. Any one of these entities should be treated as its own person, its own separate entity, right? For everything except tax. So a C corp, an LLC, or an S corp will all provide you statutory protection from liability, right? The corporation or the company is liable, not you personally, unless you've gone outside the bounds and you're a director and officer and can be liable under certain circumstances. But for the most part, only these companies will provide all the statutory limitations that you need because it's a separate person. The one thing that distinguishes them, though, is that with respect to taxation, they're not separate. A corporation's a separate person, but an LLC is not, right? What an LLC says is that for purposes of taxes, we're not going to tax the company, but we're going to tax you individually, right, at the same rate that you're already paying. Nothing more, nothing less. So the difference is that if I have $100 of income for a corporation, I'm going to pay taxes on that $100. And let's say my corporate rate is 20%. I'll pay $20 in taxes. Now I have 80 left for two founders, right? And so we can split that up. And so that's 40-40 if we're making a distribution. And then each founder will say, okay, I have received $40. I got to pay income on that, right? Or capital gains, whatever it may be. But you're paying two levels of taxation. And the perception is that, well, with an LLC, it's just going to go straight to my bottom line, right? And I won't pay that top layer. But what we found is that over time, there are a few issues with LLCs that make them a little bit more costly and a little bit harder to manage. And it's really not intuitive, but the facility, the best part about an LLC is that you can machinate it in any different way, and whatever you want to agree to, subject to a set body of LLC law in Delaware, for example, you can do a lot of different things. So if you want to have buy-sell arrangements inside of your operating agreement, instead of a stockholders agreement, that's great. If you want to issue 5 or 6 different classes of LLC interests, that's great. You could do all of this stuff. But the problem is that because you could do all of this stuff, most founders want to do all of this stuff, right? And then you start to go from what could be or should be a 2 or 3 page agreement to become more and more elaborate. And then as it changes over time, it actually costs more in transaction costs to maintain this LLC, right? That's one thing that we found. Another thing that we found is that most founders aren't really availing themselves of the tax benefits, right? If you put in 500, or for example, Dave, let's say you're founding a company and it's a company that's going to be heavily based on R&D, right? And you're going to spend $500,000 on research and development, and you have other parts of your portfolio where that loss you can offset. That's great. I'd say, Dave, you know what? Forget about a C corp. Let's form an LLC for you, and we can switch later. Not every founder has that many losses that they can offset. Another question we get from LLC formers is will investors force an LLC to convert to a C corp? Yeah, a lot of them will. There are ERISA regulations that may require a venture capital fund, if it has pension fund money from an LP, to force you to convert to an LLC. A lot of them, whether or not they have pension fund money and whether or not they need you to convert, will have a knee-jerk reaction and say that they want you to. So that their form of term sheet, we work with plenty of venture capital funds, and most of their forms of term sheet will have, if you're an LLC, one of the first lines, if you're an LLC, at closing you will be a C Corp. And so you might have to convert anyway. Okay, that's what to form and where to form in a nutshell. When to form is another question I get a lot. Hey, Charles, we've been working on this project for 3 or 4 months. We've been developing LP. We're about to file a patent. We're developing IRP. We're about to file a patent. When should we form the company? Probably should have formed it beforehand, right? My advice on formation is form it as soon as you need to protect intellectual property, allocate equity, or enter into any agreements. The quicker that you form, the faster that you will be able to avoid a couple of different issues that we see a lot. One is founders sometimes don't discuss what the allocation of equity is. For better or for worse, a lot of times founders will go on working for several months under the assumption that maybe it's pro rata, it's 50-50, right? Or that it's 80-20. And they'll come to me and first question I ask them, okay, what's the division of equity? Well, we've been talking about that. We're still not set, we're still discussing it. I'm like, okay, this is gonna be a tough discussion, right? Because now I don't know if you guys are on the same page. And what if you're not? What if one is thinking 80-20 and one is thinking, yeah, 80-20, the other way, right? There's a divide that you have to conquer. And it's better to do that very early on, before you've been working together, than it is to do that after you've formed or at formation and when you've come and you have a product. Because people have a different feeling about what their effort and involvement in that product is. And often there's a cognitive dissonance that occurs very early on. And another question is, I'm bootstrapping the company. Get it all the time, right? So I'm bootstrapping the company. I really don't want to spend a lot of money, but I want a basic form of protection. What should I do? What's your recommendation? Now, I of course recommend that any startup, particularly a technology startup that's going to be geared toward venture capital investing, be set up a certain way, which includes your certificate of incorporation, your bylaws, the board of directors option pools, NDAs, invention assignment agreements, and all things like that ready to go. But at the very least, what do you need? You need a certificate of incorporation, you need your bylaws, right? You'll have a board of directors that'll just be you or you and your partner, right? You need to issue the founder stock pursuant to a written agreement. This is what you need, right? You want to allocate that equity and have it issued so that you set the tax basis, you set the allocation, and you set the understanding among the parties as to who has what and how long you have it, all right? And then one of the things that I recommend that you do with that in that written agreement is if there's more than one founder, you infuse vesting arrangements. What's vesting? It means that anything you have day one, right, can expire, can be taken away, until over time that right to be taken away expires, right? So the company will have a repurchase right. Dave and I form a company. I'll give you the best example. Dave and I form a company, 100 shares each. We might say we've done enough work that 25 of the shares each, Dave, you agree, will vest immediately. If you leave tomorrow or if I leave tomorrow, I keep 25 or you keep 25 respectively. Right? What happens to the other 75? We could say a bunch of different things. Paradigm would be, well, the other 75, let's say 25% of that vests next year. Get 1 year, a one-year clip for an extra 25%, and then after that, maybe monthly. That seems fair, so that if you leave before, let's say, call it 4-year vest, right? If you leave before 4 years, the company gets to retain some of this equity. And by the way, if you leave before years, you get to retain some of the equity too that you built in the company, right? And that's important on your side, so that we're both protected and the company can continue to flourish. One of the most damning things for a company to have is dead stock. And a significant amount of dead stock will leave the company, afloat in the water without a rudder. What happens is, let's say, for example, the following scenario. Dave and I, again, 100 shares each, no vesting arrangement. He walks away from the company, all right? He's not working for it. I only have 50%. He still has the 50%. Let me ask you two things. It's a rhetorical question, right? How incentivized am I to work 110% of the time to make him 50% of the game? I'm not at all. And even though I might say that I am, or might feel incentivized and that this is a project I want to create, and I might try to tell myself that it doesn't bother me, it will bother you. And the more valuable that company becomes, I've seen it bother them more and more. It's just, it increases. And so it doesn't get better over time, right? That's problem one. It disincentivizes, the lack of a vesting arrangement will disincentivize a founder. Problem number two, how do investors view that, right? There's two of us in a company, and now you've walked away, and 50% of the stock is with you. And they're saying, Charles, you've done a good job building the company so far, but you need someone to help you. And I say, you're absolutely right, let's find someone. What do I give them? So I give them 15% of my stock, or 20% of my stock, or right? Where does it come from? It's not coming from the investors, right? So if it's coming from the founding team, then I'm at a point where the investors will think, well, if you only have now 25% of the equity, you're definitely not incentivized. We need to get you more equity. It becomes a circular problem that doesn't really get solved until Dave and I come to an agreement.
Let me ask you a question, because we deal with this a lot in the university setting. What people trying to get together, they're starting companies, there's an awkwardness factor about approaching your co-founders, et cetera, to talk about the split of equity, these vesting issues. What do you say to our audience about how to go about doing that? Some recommendations.
Yeah, okay, it's a great question. I think that there's a few things that you want to look at and consider. First of all, I always approach these conversations gently, with kid gloves. You're working together, you should be a team, you should be a partnership. And I'll tell founders who haven't discussed it before, think of it this way. Spend some time alone, quiet, turn off the music. Think about, in your mind, what the allocation should be. Start with the idea that you're both 50-50, and then consider a few factors. You can add some idea premium, right? Whose idea was it? Now, I'm not saying that the premium should be huge, because execution is more important than the idea, right? There's a lot of great ideas that just don't go executed. So execution is extremely important. But, there might be some value to the idea, and there's some premium involved in the idea premium. Number two, take a look at your relative experience in the area in which you're focusing, right? So if you're doing an advertising technology company, and Dave has worked for Ogilvy and done a few startups and then run a lab for ad techs, that's pretty valuable, right? Remember, and if I've just been a lawyer, I don't really know about that. I might have formed a couple of companies, but I haven't run one. That's a valuable asset to have on the team, and I think about that as that deserves a premium, right? So then the third thing is everyone putting in the same amount of time and effort? What we see a lot with startups are people are kind of feeling the way, I want to explore this idea, I'm still making money doing something else, but I'm kind of into this, and if this starts to take off, I'm going to do this full time. But I'm not there yet. I have one foot in the door, one foot out the door. Does that deserve a full allocation of equity? It might. You might say it might, and it depends on who it is, but it might only when they come on board. So think about who's putting more into the company on a day-to-day basis, right? That's important too. And so when you think about at least those three things, and there could be other things, who maybe could have more connections and lead to financing. All of these things weigh into those factors. I suggest you come out, you start off with 50-50, and then you do a little plus minus, debit credit on each side. And you come up with something close. You exchange those papers, right? And the idea is that it's got to be fair. It's got to feel fair to everyone else. But you won't get to a good, fair result if you don't at least start with a rational, objective process. So that's what I suggest you do. If it's not obvious, then you do that. Otherwise, if it's truly your idea, and you, say for example, it's your ad tech, and you're bringing me on board, you should form the company first, you should do all of that yourself, and then you should make me an offer, right? One of the mistakes that I see founders do is to be a little too collaborative, right? When they don't mean to be. People get mistaken as a co-founder or an equal owner all the time because it's not made clear that, well, it's my company. What I want you to do is come on as an employee, or as a very important employee. But I'm issuing you, a little bit of a smaller equity allocation. It's not going to be a full equity allocation.